Welcome very much, everybody, to the Raspberry Pi Computing Education Research Seminar. This is the last of our series on AI and data science education, and delighted to welcome Stefania Druga to speak to us today, and I'll introduce her fully in a moment. This seminar is presented in conjunction with the Alan Turing Institute, who we've partnered for this series. I'm Sue Sentence from the Raspberry Pi Foundation. I've been chairing throughout. And I just wanted to, before we started, just to look back on this whole series that we've had of seminars. And I know that some of you in the audience have been along to all of the seminars. Some of you might just be coming to this is your first AI seminar that we've had, but I recognize a lot of names. It's lovely to see some of you coming back. So we've just had a fantastic series with lots of different perspectives on AI education. We started off with ethics from Barry Aitken from the Alan Turing Institute. We had Carsten Schultz on October and Matti Tedra in November, looking at concepts and how we might have to teach differently. Rose Lucking brought us in the perspective of the teacher and how we might introduce teachers to AI. And we've had Dave Turetsky on the AI for K-12 program. And last month we had Tara looking at how girls can work in teams on AI projects. So in the context of all of those topics, it's really great to introduce Stefania today. So delighted that she's here. When you start looking at papers on AI education, you see Druga, lots of papers popping up that Stefania's been very prolific in writing about her work in this area. Her research, she's at the University of Washington, and her research focuses on AI literacy and the design of new computing platforms for children and parents. She's talking to us today about how children interface with smart devices, and the title of her talk is Democratizing AI Education with and for Families.
Hi, I'm Stefania Druga. I'm joining you today from Berkeley in California. I am originally from Romania, and I am currently a third-year PhD student at the University of Washington. And today I'm going to talk to you about my research on AI literacy for families. So the insights and the results I'm presenting today are actually very, very fresh. I will also present it at a conference in April at Computer-Human Interaction. So you're the first ones to get to learn more about this research that I've recently been doing. So today we know that families and especially children are growing up with AI. In US alone, there are more than 47 million homes that have a voice assistant. And this is something that is being researched. As mentioned, I've been studying how children and families learn about AI since 2017. But there are also other scholars like Bridget Barron who showed that parents play an important role in how children learn about technology and how technology is meaningfully introduced in the home. Stevens and Takeuchi also did a lot of research in terms of family joint engagement with media, and why does it matter to have balanced partnership between children and parents when they engage with new media. So there's a lot of research that informs our work. And in terms of children interacting with AI and kind of going back to how I started to do this work in 2017, when Alexas and Siris and smart toys were just picking up, we did this study where we had 26 families interact with all sorts of different smart devices, everything from chatbots to a speaking doll to a Cosmo robot to an Alexa. And what we found was that overall children perceive these smart agents, as we call them, as friendly and truthful. But when it came to intelligence attribution, deciding how smart or not smart the agents are, the age made a difference in how children attributed intelligence to devices. Younger children, we're talking 4.5 to 6.5, weren't so sure about the age and smarts, while older children, 6 to 12, were definitely saying that Alexa, for example, is smarter than they are. So this really prompted me to investigate more, like how do children attribute intelligence different to machines as compared to humans? How do they define smart for a robot or for an Alexa? And what roles do parents play? In this subsequent study, what we found was that parental attitudes and perception of intelligence of robots and smart devices actually influence children's perceptions as well. So we had kids and parents participate in a study separately, and they would watch videos of a robot solving a maze, a mouse solving a maze, and then they got to solve a maze by teleoperating the robots. And then we asked them who did it better and why. And what we found was that even if children and parents participated in this study separately, their explanations were very similar. If they were choosing the robot to be smarter because they said, oh, robots are very smart because they learn from data and they learn faster than a mouse or than a human, or at the same time, we would have pairs of children and parents that would say, robots are not smart. People are like smarter because they get to decide like what the robot learns and teach them by giving them examples or by programming them. So even back in 2018, we saw that the level of exposure to programming or different AI technologies really influenced the attitudes and the perception families had, and this kind of prompted and primed their experience when engaging with these devices. We also found that intelligent toys are even able to influence children moral decisions. Like we had a study where we had talking dolls that was trying to influence children choices, if it's okay or not okay to stand when everyone is sitting, if it's okay or not okay to hit another child with a pillow. And what we found, and this was a pilot study, that in some cases, the smart toys can influence children even more than another human being, like what we call a confederate. Again, this was a pilot study, and the reason this matters is these devices are known to have sometimes security problems. Like this doll, my friend Kayla, was actually hacked, and it's banned to be purchased in some markets in Europe. You can still buy it on Amazon in the US. So it's kind of concerning if we have these devices in the home, which have security privacies that get compromised, security faults that get compromised. What would happen if children don't have a critical understanding of what is normal or not normal for a device to say or to ask them to do? And this is why it's important to raise a critical understanding and use of smart devices. One way of doing that is to actually allow children and parents to program these devices or program their own smart assistant. And we've been doing that. This is a longitudinal study we ran for 5 weeks in lots of different settings, private schools, public schools, community centers. This was international. I also ran sessions all over different locations in Europe. And what we found is that when children actually get to train their own custom machine learning models by giving examples of pictures or text, or when they get to program Alexa and teach Alexa how to answer to certain questions, they become much more skeptical of the smarts of these like voice assistants or different smart devices. So in the beginning, like before they start programming, we asked them like how smart they think Alexa is, if it's smarter than them. So we see here there were many more maybes and yes. And then after they did all these different programming sessions, we asked the same questions again, and we saw many more kids saying no, like really understanding that the reason these devices are smart is because they actually learn from data created by people, and they are being programmed by someone. One thing that stood out from that programming experience is that after doing the whole study, many young kids, as young as 7, told me that they are very happy that people their age get the opportunity to do this kind of programming. And one child who was 6.5 told me when my dad was young, he was learning how to fix cars and how cars work. And now we do this, like these are the cars of our generation, right? So that's like very inspiring that we could have someone so young to really understand what are the trade-offs, like how do smart devices work? How do they get agency to decide how to recognize specific objects or how to program specific behaviors, or if they should even have the robot or an Alexa answer certain questions, or maybe we should just keep that for family conversations. So right before the pandemic started, we started doing a series of workshops with families in person. This was at the University of Washington campus. And we had a series of sessions with families over the weekends that would come and we do this co-design activities and playful activities where they got to come up with all sorts of different ways in which they could trick different AIs. So for this applications where you get to draw and the application guesses what you draw, like they came up with ways in which they could trick it by either drawing at the same time or making a drawing that is confusing. With Alexa, they were trying to trick it by imitating each other's voices or putting different accents. When they were training vision models, they tried to see like, oh, what if my dad will take my bow and I put a lot of pictures where I'm using this bow? Would it detect that my dad is me? And what we found from these sessions that was very interesting is that children and parents actually have a very different notion of algorithmic bias. What is creepy or what is unfair for adults is not always creepy or unfair for children. And you have to remember that this generation is growing up with this technology very often in the home. So it's important to really understand, like, what do children think of algorithmic fairness? Because actually children don't know what the word bias means, but they do know what the word fairness means, right? So they definitely have a strong sense of justice. Like, what does it mean to be fair? Like, even in their family, if a sibling gets a cookie, they need to get a cookie too, or things need to be shared evenly. So kind of translating some of those moral values into how these devices are interacting with their peers or their friends. Like, why is Alexa recognizing my voice but not recognizing my friend's voice? Or why can I play this game with rock, paper, scissors with computer vision, but my friend who has a different skin tone could not play it? How can I fix it? Another thing that was very interesting when we ran these sessions was when we asked both children and parents to draw what is inside a voice assistant, how does it work? And a lot of times they came up with examples that were surprising for families, right? Here you can see a child kind of drawing with Post-its, the company of Alexa, where there are lots of different people inside and every person is specialized in answering a specific type of questions. Or other times children will draw these devices kind of like a series, like there's a phone inside and a series of apps and someone is like scrolling between the different apps. So we definitely see how people have, and especially young people, very different mental models for how these devices work, particularly informed by their prior use of different technologies and exposure to different technologies. So what we still wanted to learn was what happens and how do children and parents actually learn about AI together when they do the activities together, and how we could design learning supports and learning activities that are primarily done for this joint family engagement for family literacy. So we ran a new study, and this one had to be done online because it was during 2020 when people were stuck at home. But this gave us a unique opportunity to actually spend a lot of time with kids and parents at home and have these learning activities in the home. So we actually had 15 families that attended for a 5 weeks in-home study. This was more than 34 participants, and these were very diverse families. They spoke more than 11 languages, very different socioeconomical background, exposure to technology, ethnicity, expectations, cultural heritage. And they were coming from all over North America, from 10 USA states. So for each of the family, we had 5 sessions. This included 11 learning activities. And the design of these learning activities was informed by the theory of multiple literacies, which says that there are so many different ways in which people learn, either through situated practice, overt instruction, having critical framing, and transforming their own practice. So we took these dimensions of multiliteracy and tried to apply it for our activities for AI literacy. Before starting the learning sessions, we wanted to see where people are coming from. So we definitely had a series of interviews and questions just to see like what they think of AI, when they use it, if they decide to have smart devices at home, why they decide to do it, why they decide not to do it. And what we found here was that overall, most families were concerned around questions of privacy, and like were concerned because they didn't feel like they were in control of what data is being collected, that there wasn't enough transparency to know like what data is being sent to the companies, what data is being stored locally, how they could customize that. So most of the parents really express a need for having more control and customization. A lot of the parents also expressed a lot of frustration because they said, in particular, voice assistants were not always sensitive to recognizing different accents, or even if they were available in different language, the cultural references were not there. So there was clearly a need to have more diverse team of developers that are creating these applications and skills for families. Another thing that we found was that many of the skills that are presented as skills for youth or for kids actually don't even have like 85% of the skills for youth on Alexa market don't have a privacy policy. And it's not even clear how parents should decide what their child should use or not, because they don't know what data is being collected. So clearly there are some issues there. So now that we knew where people are coming from, we start our learning sessions. The first session was focused on image classification. So both kids and parents got to learn more about how computers classify images. And we had a playbook, we called it a playbook, on this choral learning activities and 2 games. So children and parents got to play a classification game where they would classify different images of corals, and they got to decide what categories they put them in and how to name the categories, how to change it. And then they played an anchor game where they got to pick a segment to tell the computer what's the most important part of the image. So if the computer would only look at a very tiny segment of an image, how would it know that this is a healthy coral or unhealthy coral, for example? These activities and games and everything we did is actually available online. We open sourced all the curriculum and the platforms. And they're all available for you to play with as well at AIplayground.me. I have the link on the slides in a few slides. What we found from this image classification was that children really like to drive the activities, but parents were there to support. And very often, especially in families that had older children from 9 to 12, parents would also learn a lot from children's logic and reasoning around, oh, why should we pick a fragment that has more contrast in the image? How would the computer learn over time to detect contrast? What sort of rules would the computer use to detect contrast in an image, and why does contrast matter? Or children were also the first ones to have the idea, maybe we should involve citizen scientists or experts. So have a group of experts that can collaborate and teach computers to detect specific species of corals. What was very nice was that when families got to reflect on how could we use this type of games to make something meaningful for society, parents really played the role of a mentor and a collaborator for their children, and they prompted them to think of personal experiences, like when they visited an aquarium, and what did they observe, and how could this activity be used in that context. They also prompted them to think about climate change and how we could use actually to have robots that can detect when a coral is getting sick and maybe try to help the coral. So it was very nice to see how both children and parents were playing to their strengths, and we're taking turns in playing these games, but also reflecting about the activity. In the second session, which was focused on machine learning, we had 3 activities. The families first used mobile apps to detect objects in the home, and got to play around and try to see like what the phone can pick up or not pick up, if there are objects that are unknown and why. And then they got to train their own model. There was this scavenger hunt where they trained the custom model to detect different objects. And at the end, we had a prediction game where they had to guess what the computer would detect in the cases of very tricky images that could confuse it. What we found here was that in the process of training and testing their own model, both children and parents got much more insight into how the computers perceive the world, which is sometimes very different from how humans perceive the world. So they got to see like, oh, if I'm actually having a noisy background, lots of different objects in the background, it's much harder for the computer to see I have a coffee mug or that I have any sort of object. So here we see an example of a child suggesting like, oh, let's actually put a white sheet or like maybe aim it at the ceiling to avoid this noise, right? And see what the computer could actually detect. Parents were also very good at tinkering with their kids and suggesting lots of tricks to treat the AI and break the AI and then fix it. They would suggest rotating the objects or picking objects that have like very similar color, like maybe if the Xbox was a white thing, like pick another white object that was very similar to that. And overall, like this was one of the most engaging activity for the families because it was highly embodied. They got to move around, search for objects. It was very easy to take turns, but also because they really, really enjoyed breaking the AI and then fixing it. This was something that they was the most engaging for both kids and parents. In session 3, they got to learn more about voice assistants. So here we had a game where they were comparing with AI, where we had a series of questions that both the family member and a voice assistant would answer. And then the family got to decide who answered it better and why. And we had also the draw how it works, like doing another series of like drawing what's inside and how it works. And what we found here was that overall families thought that the voice assistants were better at giving factual answers, like when you ask something about the weather or even like general knowledge, like the first 10 digits of pi. But when it came to personal questions, like do I have any pets? Or when it came to more like logic or philosophical questions, like what came first, the chicken or the egg, family members were better. And in general, the families didn't like when the devices was giving too long of an answer, when it was like an entire Wikipedia article. So they had a lot of ideas of how to improve this interaction. In particular, they wanted to have the option to customize, like, this is how I would like you to answer this type of questions, and have the option to teach the device, like, oh, this was not correct, let me tell you what is the correct answer, which currently they cannot do. And based on these experiences, in the 4th session, we invited families to design their own assistants and then to analyze assistants. So what we found here was that overall, children and parents had a lot of ideas, and it was very interesting to see how they would discuss for each sensor, for example, what are the trade-offs between having something that is friendly and usable, but at the same time that could discriminate people or that could be biased for certain populations. So we had a family that designed Asha, which is an assistant that actually does not record voice, does not have a microphone, but you could use it through gestures. So this could be a voice assistant either for people that use sign language, or in general that is more respectful of privacy. So it could also be, it could only be used through different gestures, and then it would also have a touch screen. We also have lots of discussions between kids and parents around like, oh, what would make the device creepy? Is it still creepy if it has a face of a robot instead of a face of an animal or a face of a person? Why does it matter to actually have the device to be portable? Like we see here, a family wanted to have a portable Alexa 2 that has like a hugs kit. Yeah, it was interesting to see how family members negotiated their needs, but also what sort of arguments they were using by this point, because this was session 4, to sort of imagine how the device could be misused, or what are unanticipated potential like harmful consequences of having certain sensors and certain capabilities. So overall, what we found was that families are interested to learn about AI together if the activities are designed for that and they're appropriate for family use, that they really engage. And it's a unique field because it's new, both for kids and parents. So it was easier for kids to step in and also teach their parents and not have the learning activities be driven primarily by parents. However, it was very important to have the parents there, especially when it came to this conversation around ethics and how do we make this meaningful for our family, and what is okay or not okay for a device to say or to do, and how do we mitigate some of the existing algorithmic biases. We found that overall parents played a variety of roles when supporting their kids, everything from cheerleading, like emotionally supporting them, to mediating, collaboration between siblings or child interaction with the activity, mentoring them, guiding them to get more nuanced understanding of certain abilities and features, teaching them like either general knowledge concepts like about corals or climate change, but also technical concepts, observing and learning also from their children. Joint roles was this role of thinker, where both children and parents were breaking, fixing, testing the different AI games together, and collaboration, where they really took turns, listened to each other, changed their mind, and were actively engaged together in the activities. In terms of the design of activities, like I mentioned, we built a lot of curriculum and playbooks, games, printouts. They're all available online at aiplayground.me. So you could actually download them and print them or try them with your families at home. And what we found was we tracked for each activity what variety of roles they supported for families. And what we found is that from all of our sessions, the activities and the sessions that supported the widest variety of roles for family were the activities that were embodied, like the training machine learning activity, and the activities that were tangible, where families got to work on paper, like print a design sheet, and they had like sensor toolkits that they got to use, and cutouts. And so anything that was tangible was highly engaging for families. So we think in the future, having more embodied and tangible learning activities is something that works well for family AI literacy. Overall, we've seen that family AI literacy, both the practice and the skills, helped families to reconsider the way they use some of these technologies, and they started to envision and also plan how to make more meaningful use of smart devices they already have in their home, and how they could redesign their interaction with them. How could they, like, for example, with the compare with AI, whenever they ask a question, think of like, oh, how would I answer that question? Or like, what part of this answer is maybe not correct, or not fully informed? So these findings suggest that family really has the potential to become a third space, like a space where critical debate is being constructed for AI literacy. So I mentioned we have like a lot of printouts. Here's an example of a poster that we designed with 6 ingredients for family AI literacy, things like mutual engagement, co-creation, have activities that do boundary crossing, that relate to personal histories, both for different generations, encourage collaborative inquiry, tap into families' intention to develop, and allow both kids and parents to focus on the content and not get stuck because they don't know how to use a game or a device. So thank you for your attention. I know this was a lot of content, and I see I'm doing well on time. Our paper is available online. I'll put the link in the chat right now. As I mentioned, the study materials are also available. And yeah, I will pause and open it up for questions. Thanks again for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed. And we usually just do a jazz hands or a thank you or a thumbs up in the chat or in the box or whatever the reactions. So thank you very much. We feel very privileged to have the first preview of your paper that you're delivering in April. So that's great. So now we're going to go into small breakout groups. And there aren't any specific questions unless Stefania, you've quickly thought of some, but what we just like you to do is to just talk about what you've heard. There's lots of different ideas from Stefania, and come back with some questions or comments or your own experiences so that we could share that after about 15 minutes in the general Q&A. I just heard that. Wish we could have more time to talk. That's brilliant. But it's nice to have Stefania in the room, and then we can carry on the conversation. So I'm going to ask a question while everyone gets. I'll start off. So Stefania, I thought that was really interesting about how you're working with these families and this concept of AI literacy. What's your next steps in your research? You're coming to the end of your PhD. What's the next? Have you got what have your project ahead? How are you taking this forward?
Yeah, I did not expect that question, Sue.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I am actually starting a research residency with Ex Moonshot Factory, where I'm going to work on a project around future tools for software development, and it's confidential, but I think I am allowed to say that it's in the domain of collaborating on programming with AI. For my research, like this year, I'm actually currently recruiting families for another study. It is in the blog post that I linked. And I saw someone was saying that some links were not working. So if you're missing links or you can't access things, please let me know. I want to make sure you have all of the resources. But yeah, in this blog post, I basically announced that we're recruiting more families. And right now, like in the spring break, I am doing another study with families where we have pair programming with AI and creative coding with AI. So it's not just like programming the devices themselves, but actually have different agents that collaborate with kids and parents when they're learning how to program their smart games. So those are some of the projects. There are a lot of papers in the that are coming still. Unfortunately, the research world goes slow. So, I'm presenting now a study that I've done in 2020. So I was finally able to open source all the materials. But we do have a couple of studies that are coming this year. And I'll keep you posted. The best place to follow up on that, all of my publications and projects are on my website, and I am keeping it updated. So if you want to have everything in one place, that's one place to go to. But this is, the work on education, technology education for youth is something that I've been doing since 2012. And I think I will work on this for a very long time. And it's kind of, we've seen applications like Copilot, where you have pair programming with AI for adults, and kind of imagining what does that look like for younger people, and how do we use these technologies to give agency to people, like, and involve the parents as well, because I think for a long time parents were left out from CS education or technology education. That's something that I care a lot about, and I'm going to continue to work on in different capacities. Okay, I see questions coming in the chat.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So I'll go. Prem Prasad has got his hand up, so we'll go to Prem first, and then we'll go to Hamad's got a question, and then Tracy stroke Brenda, and I've got Jane on my list. Prem Prasad, do you want to start? Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, yes. Stefania, thanks for your excellent talk. It was full of insights. So congratulations for that. And I just want to have one question. If you were to teach an age group, say of grade 8, 9, and 10, or over the age of 14, what kind of projects would you do? What would be your approach?
What were the two age groups? Could you say that again, please?
Say for high school.
One of the studies that is coming, I was collaborating with Tom Ball from Microsoft Research, and we did a study with high school students. And it was around programming games, like video games or different arcade devices. But I got to see how, like high schoolers would engage with similar content, or also like how they approach programming of smart games. I think a lot of these activities do transfer or translate also in being used with high school students. It's just a matter of going in more depth, right? So for example, like when they get to draw what is inside the AI, maybe they drew their initial drawing, but then afterwards you can give them a kit of like, here are the different components. How do you think like they're connecting to each other? Or can you show me the data flow? Like what happens from like the moment I voice the question and how it's being interpreted. So a lot of these activities could be adapted just to have a little bit more detail and depth, but be used with older students. In terms of programming, like I have used Coffee Mates with high schoolers, and they do enjoy it a lot, especially the part where they get to train a model with their own images. But then once they have a trained model, they can build pretty much any sort of Scratch program with it, right? And the training sometimes is tedious. So if you have high school students, you could imagine at a class level or a larger group activity, have, pick a topic that they care about. There are lots of AI camps where we've seen high schoolers like taking topics in medicine, right? Like, oh, how can we use all the images that are being used to detect certain types of cancer. And then they do this research together, because that's more tedious, like collecting the images or even going outside. Like, let's take all pictures of these species of beetle that is disappearing, right? And train a model to recognize that. So that's more tedious. And so you would have a group of high schoolers that spend more time like collecting the data. But once you train the model, each and one of them could build a web app or a game or a program that is using this model in different ways. So I think that's definitely low-hanging fruit and a great opportunity for classrooms with high schoolers, like thinking like, what is the activity that is collaborative? Usually cleaning data, collecting data is tedious, takes more time, so it's nice to do it together, but then also allow each of the students to create their own applications, give it their own personal twist, right? And use the model in different creative ways. Thanks for the questions, Bram.
Thanks a lot for a very convincing answer. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. So we're moving swiftly on to Hamad, who had a question in the chat and some other comments. So I'll let you choose which of those you want to ask. Hamad?
I think Prem's question is pretty sort of relevant to what I was going to ask. It was basically a really good discussion on replicating the whole child-parent interaction model in the classroom. But now, I mean, thank you for the answer, but you've spoken about high school. How would you recommend this approach to younger kids then, and that same sort of learning being replicated in the classroom with younger kids?
So I think in terms of evidence-based, this framework of joint engagement from Takeuchi and Stevens that we have since 2011 is a great place to start with. I'll paste the link as soon as I'm done talking. It's also cited in my paper. But yeah, like that's really like something that has been used in lots of different settings and different learning scenarios. It's done primarily for joint engagement between kids and parents, but there's a lot of work in CSCW proceedings that build on this, that also show how you could use the framework of joint engagement for groups of kids, right? Not only kids with their parents, you could have just groups of kids in a classroom. So I can definitely put the link to the CSCW proceedings. Like that would be the conference to look at if you're looking for more evidence-based theoretical approaches for how to design for collaborative learning. In terms of, so there's two pieces, right? Like one is like, how do we design for collaborative learning? And that's like independent if it's about AI or, you know, science, anything else, right? So there's something there about having in mind how you build on people's strengths and their prior knowledge, like use this thing that it's also known as funds of knowledge. So there's a lot of theory on funds of knowledge. So people learn better if you kind of connect the content to things they already know. So it's like this zone of proximal development from Vygotsky. But what I've tried to do in my work, and that's why it's called like family is a third place, instead of having a personal individual zone of proximal development, you have a collective zone of proximal development, right? So instead of being just me with my prior experiences or definitions or knowledge or things that I was exposed to, now I also have maybe my parents or my friends or my siblings. And then that's where a lot of sense making happens. In the paper we published last year, with my advisor, Amy Ko at IDC, we showed how children do collaborative sense making of AI through programming. So it's really like this collective zone of proximal development is the sweet spot, because you just learn much faster if you're able to, like, you don't know the answer to a question, but your friend does, and he's explaining it to you. And I think we can all agree that the best way of learning is to teach, right? So, so yeah, I think the things I would start with is this framework of joint engagement from Stevens and Takeuchi, looking at other literature from CSCW on collaborative sense making, and I'll definitely put the relevant publications in the chat.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
So I think I'm just working down the chat. So Tracy and Brenda. So Brenda, do you want to ask any of the points that you raised in your group?
Mine, I was just a bit curious. First, I found it interesting the bit you mentioned on bias and how the kids were able to identify bias. Then you used the example of like Alexa couldn't recognize the voice of one over the other. So I was just curious as you were speaking, the first is like, was there a difference of, would you like ideally teach what bias is before the class? And then, you know, given whichever tasks the students will have maybe over the next 2 hours, hopefully, I mean, like, so the kids will be alert or aware that there's such a thing as bias and that they will recognize it? Or would it be that you don't even tell them about bias and they go through a couple of exercises and then at the end you kind of like, hopefully they'll have, you know, when you're asking them how was your experience or to describe the session, that they might point out a thing or two that you then, you know, point them to bias. So I was just curious, like, generally, or also in terms of research, does it, you know, check the numbers, like will the students have identified it? I was just really curious about that. And then second was still on bias. Well, you mentioned Alexa, it sounded a bit maybe easy to point out bias using a technical device like that. But in my scenario in a class maybe that I've done in the past, let's say I was giving students an easy exercise of collecting data for the weather, and then I'm telling them that we can predict whether maybe by having collected this data. So with such an exercise or any unplugged activity exercise, I don't know if there's any resources of how would I then teach bias with such kind, you see, like with that, it's not that direct. I don't know if you get my point, but yeah, I was just curious about those two.
This is definitely an area that requires so much research. I'm going to send a link. So this is going to come out. MIT Press will publish this as a physical book later this year. And I contributed an article that goes more in depth about the algorithmic bias and how we research that with kids. You can read it online. I just pasted the link. But when I wanted to really take apart this question of how do kids perceive like different forms of algorithmic bias, one thing we did, this is a previous study, we showed them video clips, which were showing different scenarios. Like one video was showing an AI computer vision that was not able to recognize darker skin tones. This includes the work on gender gaze from gender shades, from Joy Bolamini at MIT Media Lab, who did a lot of pioneering work in this area of algorithmic bias. We showed them a video of like just having different people standing in front of a computer vision algorithm, and some people were detected and others were not because of their different skin tones. And we asked them what they think about that and how they would fix it, for example. Another video we showed them was voice assistants stuck in an infinite loop because they were talking to each other. We also showed them a video of a very young child trying to get Alexa to start. And it just wasn't working. So this was like a 4-year-old and was really trying to play Baby Shark on Alexa. I don't know if you know Baby Shark. Don't listen to it. It's going to ruin your morning. It's like this viral, very popular video for kids. So yeah, so this little girl, you know, she can barely talk. She really wanted Alexa to play Baby Shark, and Alexa just wouldn't understand her. So she turns to her mom and say, mommy, make it play Baby Shark. So we showed this. Then we had videos of different assistants that were not always female voices. So there are voice assistants that are gender neutral voices, and we played the different clips. We tried lots of different, to present lots of different scenarios of algorithmic bias, either through voice or vision, or just like because of the data, like how, you know, search engine, if you search for certain like wedding dresses, you only get Western wedding dresses, right? Instead of getting wedding dresses from all over the world, which are very different. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in this space. I would recommend that you look at the work from Blakely Payne, who specialized on AI ethics, and she created a curriculum that is publicly available, that is primarily focused on that. This was co-designed with teachers, and it has activity for very, very different age groups. So that would be a good place to look at as well. I'll try to find the link and post it. But honestly, I think the way we think about bias, define bias, the way we think about algorithmic fairness, it really changes in different parts of the world. For me, it was mind-opening it was so inspiring to see, you know, when I did workshops with kids in Berlin or in Denmark or in Chile, like I literally did like this kind of activities all over the world, and people mistrust technology much more in Germany than they do in US, right? And kids as well. Like kids would not want to have an Alexa at home, right? And so a lot of these questions are cultural, and even these questions of bias and like are very much context driven, which is why it's so important to do this research in different languages in different parts of the world and really understand like how do we design inclusive AI education and inclusive AI technologies.
That's a really comprehensive answer, and we do save the Zoom chat so that we've got captured all these links and we can circulate it to everybody. So thank you so much. Jane's got questions that would probably take us up till the end.
I know. So I'm just going to. So first of all, our group was amazing. It's just we had such a lovely discussion, but that was because Stefania, you just gave us so many things to talk about. So I think your work is really important, and I just wanted to thank you for the huge contribution that I think you're making to this field. And I'm going to ask my question actually. So I'm going to be really selfish. And I'm really interested how you decided on the concepts, the vocabulary, tasks, and the progression of learning activities, because it felt really carefully constructed. And I just wondered how you got to that point, and is it written down somewhere? Because I looked in the paper and the paper seemed to be about something else rather than the kind of toolkit.
The progression matters a lot, and I definitely think it helped. It was really also a unique set of circumstances because I tried to get parents to work with kids for extended periods of time before, right? When I was doing workshops in person. And it's tricky because sometimes parents are busy, and especially if I want to have a diverse group of families that come. The reality is that, you know, certain families need to have multiple jobs, right? Or that cannot afford to, I don't know, like outsource some of their chores or other things. So they're very busy. They don't have time to, they drop their kids to the workshops, but they don't necessarily have time to also stay for the sessions. So this was a unique set of circumstances because kids were stuck at home with parents, and parents were going crazy, like to figure out what to do to keep their kids busy, or like what to do, like to, you know, they realize, I think it's a very unique moment in time in terms of not only AI education, but education as a whole, because kids were stuck at home for almost 2 years. Parents for the first time were finally exposed to some of the challenges of technology education, but just in general, like education, and how hard it was to do this on video conferencing. So it was a very unique opportunities because they already had this need. They wanted to do something with their kids. They were invested because they realized like, oh, they don't understand so many things, and technology instruction is so much more support. So that helped me to get access to their time for 5 weeks. And we paid parents like for participating, and that really allowed for them to free up the time, right? But I think it was nice. First of all, like this was the baseline, like how do we get parents to be there and have enough time, like 5 sessions where they can sit with the content at home, have conversations, do the printouts. We would send them the playbooks and the printouts ahead of time. And a lot of the families would actually like try and come, and when they were coming to the session, they already had questions for us and we're coming prepared. So I think that was something that worked very well. In terms of the progression, it helped me that I had these sessions I've done in person in prior studies that were co-designed. So it really helped me to adjust how much we could do in one session, also what language works and what language doesn't work, what terms are complicated and what terms are understood. So the short answer is just lots of iterations. There's no magic formula. So I think if you're designing for a specific group, like your classroom or your community or a group of families you're working with, is just being very honest with them and saying like, let's figure this out together and let's try something, and involving them as part of the design process and managing the expectation that this is work in progress really helps. Plus it gives them agency in their own learning because they get to say like, oh, this worked for me, this didn't work for me, right? So in the final interviews, when we collected feedback, they had so many things to say, like that they would like to change or add, or how they could do it differently, right? So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it's...
I suppose the question is, where can I find out the concepts that you taught, or do I need to work it out from the resources? So if I wanted to understand the concepts that you're getting at, would I need to just read the resources, or is it elsewhere?
In the playbooks, each playbook has the core concept, and the playbooks are literally like slides online that are on this AI Playground website.
Cool, thank you. That was brilliant, Anne. Thank you.
No problem.
That's lovely. I think Ethel's got a question in the chat. So I'll come, Ethel, if you're there, to you next, and then I'll go to Kate Farrell, who's written a point I think is really good to make as well. Ethel, over to you.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you, Sue. Nice to see you again. So I think you answered most of our group questions, but I just want to tell you they all loved the idea of the parent-child collaboration. And I think one of them was interested in doing this with their family members and was wondering if you kind of like have guidelines, you know, because now you tried something, it works well. Did you put up some guidelines of how family members can adopt and learn together? That's the first question. And then the second one is, are you planning on doing a longitudinal study where you kind of like further investigate how this impacts their learning of AI in the school? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Ethel. Yeah, so in terms, these long-term studies, right? It's always like, you always want more. So I work with these families for 5 weeks. And then of course, you know, we got to really know each other. And then I did another studies with the same families for another 5 weeks. And I will definitely, with the same families for another 5 weeks, and I will definitely involve them in the current Wizard of Oz. So it's nice to build that rapport and trust with a community of families that I can work with for a very long time. I definitely think it has trade-offs because clearly they will be biased, right, for my next studies because they were exposed to all of these different learning activities. So I need to present that and be very transparent about what my relationship with them is and like what were the prior activities they've done before. But it helps because I think it's important. It takes time for people to get to know each other and gain trust, and for me to understand like much more about the context of each family. And I think in terms of how much more long-term I could research this, like I'm planning to email these families a year from now and maybe 2 years from now and see like, oh, how are you still like, are you using smart devices? How are you using it? How did this change, right? Or if when I'm building platforms like Cognimates or this tile code we worked on with Tom Ball, you know, it's always nice to go back like 6 months later, a year later and say like, are you still using this? Like, how did it change how you learn? And I think for me, it's very important. Like, that's why it's not just a paper. That's why it's like making the effort to write the blog posts and open source the resources. And we have a Slack channel for all the families. So we created a community not only for them and us, but for amongst themselves, right? So at the end, like there was a celebration where all the families came together and they shared like their final projects. They got to know each other. Then we discovered like, oh, there were families where the kids were cousins and they were both in the study and they didn't know. So there's this aspect of also building a community, which I think it's quite important. I don't know, what was your other question? I'm sorry, I forgot.
I was saying probably you answered it, but but I'm not sure if it was specific to family members. Someone wanted to replicate this in the family context and was wondering if you have guidelines.
Yeah, if you want to replicate this, I would love to talk to you. I'm happy to, you know, like talk in more depth about the curriculum is online. You can adapt it or reuse it. The paper describes the method in detail, but I'm always happy to chat with you. I'll put my email in the chat. So if anyone here wants to replicate it or modify or try variation for different age groups or families in different settings, I would love to support you. I think that would be great. I'll paste my link in the chat. And the other thing, like going back to Jane's question from earlier, I do think that there's a lack of much more support for educators, teachers, parents, like in understanding the basics of some of these machine learning, computer vision, AI concepts, right? Like really breaking it down and making it as concrete as possible. I'm sure when you heard from Dave Turetsky, AI for K-12 is trying to do part of that work with their big ideas, but there's much more. I usually learn through projects. I am a big fan of project-based learning. So one thing that I'm working on right now, one of my best friends, Nancy Otero, who's from Mexico, and had a project-based learning school, where we're working on a book for Make Magazine, which has 10 projects for AI learning. And this book is primarily written for educators. So the idea is that each chapter, you'll learn a different, very specific concept, like, oh, how do I collect data from sensors and infer information from this data and modify it, and what I could do with it. Can I actually have, you know, something that I could use for sports, like when I play sports and like learn how to hit the ball better, or oh, maybe I have a pet, like can I train a model to recognize things like that my pet does in the house and things like that. So we're trying to create more materials, because I do think that starting with a project that people care about, and throughout the project also really understanding in depth, like, oh, how does supervised learning works? How many samples do I need? Like, what are the trade-offs? How much time does it take? What's the math behind it, right? But having a project that one could try out, that can kind of, where you have the situated conceptual learning, I think helps. So stay tuned, that's coming. Hopefully we're aiming to have it out printed before the next school year, so before September. That's something that we're pushing hard right now, to have AI projects, books specifically for educators.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we've got a few announcements to make, so I think we're going to wrap up questions now, unless Kate, you wanted to make your point quickly that you wrote in the comment.
I don't have to, but yeah, it was just I really like the fact that the kids came up with accessibility use cases. And I think technology is always better for the whole of society when we manage to get those use cases. So like personally in my family, we have, my son has speech difficulties, we use sign language. And the fact that kids came up with that kind of sign language and gestures, I quite liked. Our Alexa usage has certainly got more interesting when we've realized that my son can say echo, understandably, but not Alexa. So we've changed the watchwords, and now we get AJR playing, blasting music around the flat. That was all.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, nice thing to end with. So so we can all say thank you again to Stefania for all the brilliant and fantastic answers to all those questions we threw at you as well. Really interesting talk. I'm sorry if some questions weren't answered. Stefania, you can see the questions that were in the chat.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the amazing questions. I really enjoyed chatting with you. I wish we had more time.
Yeah, it's great to have such a rich discussion. I've just got a few announcements. You will be the first people to hear about the next series, the first ever people. It's not on social media yet. So if you just hold on for 1 minute. First of all, we really would love you, it's the end of the series, to fill in our survey. Diana will also send it by email, but you could make a note there. It's quite easy to remember, because we want to make these seminars better. So any feedback you've got for us would be fantastic. So we're going to have April off. So we're going to come back in May, and we've got the speakers you can see on your slide. So in May the 3rd, we've got Mark Gusdile, who many of you will have heard of, you know, quite a legend in computing education, coming to talk to us about teaspoon programming. I should have said the theme of the series is teaching computing across disciplines. So we're looking at where computing can be taught across different subjects and in non-formal learning. So we're starting off with Mark Gusdile, who's adding a teaspoon of computing. We move on to Pratim Sengupta, who's just had I've got it here, who's just published a book, or maybe not just, but called Voicing Coding in STEM, which is a really interesting book, but based around science classrooms. Yasmin Kafar, many of you will know, has been around for decades, and amazing work in computational participation, mainly around what we call DT, design technology, electronic textiles. And then we have a break in August. We always have a break in August because of people's holidays. Come back in September for Genevieve Smith-Nunes, who does data-driven dance. We'll also have October, November and December. We'll be announcing those in May, but hopefully you'll be look forward to that series and come along to that series too. Thank you again to Stefania. Thank you everybody, and we'll see you in May.